Welcome, everybody. This is Norton Rainey, president of ACE Scholarships. Thank you so much for calling in today. For those who know about ACE, we appreciate you joining in to learn more about COVID-19 from Congressman Gianforte and the energy sector from Chris Wright. And for those who are brand new, we really appreciate you taking time. We recognize how busy you are, and today is going to be a very informative day. But before I introduce Congressman Gianforte and Chris Wright, let me give a shout out to our partners in our 8 states because we have a great representation here. We have members from Arkansas, Colorado, Kansas, Louisiana, Missouri, Montana, Texas, and Wyoming. So thanks again to Congressman Gianforte, who has a firsthand approach to COVID-19, and to Chris, who right now is on the front lines of energy. At the end, we will have time for questions, and the way you can ask a question is by hitting *3. In fact, if you had a question right now, you could hit *3 and it will go into the queue. And when we have time, we'll make sure that we do our best to address those questions. If we can't, we'll send a follow-up email asking or addressing those as much as we can. But first, before we go into these topics here, let me just share a little bit more about ACE Scholarships and why we exist. It's quite simple. There is an education crisis in our country. In America today, there are more than 30 million low-income families that are trapped in communities that are low-performing. And unfortunately, that means low-income kids don't have access to the school that they need to. And the sad reality is that they're not performing and our country is falling further behind. And this represents a tremendous need, and that's why ACE exists. Our impact is absolutely extraordinary. Our mission is to provide children of low-income families with scholarships to private schools in grades K through 12 and to advocate for expanded choice. Over 20 years, we've given 42,000 scholarships. We've given over 102 million in scholarships, and we partner currently with over 800 private schools. And the best part about our program is that students in ACE graduate at a rate of over 90% from high school, and they graduate from college at twice the rate of their peers in public schools. However, the current crisis we're facing currently has really compounded issues right now and the hardships our families face, widening the educational inequality gap and putting them at an even greater disadvantage. So this afternoon, we will address these challenges and discuss ways in which we can support our most at-risk students. So first off, I'd like to welcome Congressman Greg Gianforte from the great state of Montana. Congressman Gianforte is also a candidate for governor in Montana. He is a great leader. As the founder of Right Now Technologies, you should know that he is one of the best entrepreneurs out there. He and his wife, Susan, founded Right Now at the basement of their home and eventually sold to Oracle. And Congressman Gianforte, let me turn it over to you because right now we've got a pandemic with COVID-19. And you know more about this than probably anyone. What we do know is that there are over 3 million global cases currently around the world, over 225,000 deaths worldwide. And here in the United States, the coronavirus cases exceed over 1 million with over 60,000 deaths. Today, I learned that we have over 30 million families that are low income, or I should say 30 million families that have filed for unemployment. Congressman, question number 1, can you please give us a national perspective as a U.S.man painting a picture of COVID-19 and the impact to our country?
Sure, Norton, thank you. And first, let me just give a shout out to ACE and your leadership, Norton. We've been privileged to partner with ACE because I think all of us can agree we have to help every child reach their full potential. And that's what ACE is all about. That's why my wife, Susan, and I have been so proud to stand with you and support ACE and help you expand across this country to change more lives. But you're right, we are in unprecedented times. None of us have ever experienced a pandemic like this. And there are really 2 crises. One is the public health crisis. The second is the economic crisis that has resulted. We have had to necessarily put our finger on the pause button on the economy in order to stop the spread of the virus. I have good news today. All of the hot spots in the country have begun to stabilize. We are getting our arms around this. I'm talking nearly daily with health officials at a national level. We have over 200 compounds, both vaccines, therapeutics, and other antibodies in clinical trial now. I was on a call with NIH and HHS earlier today. They were optimistic that we might even have a vaccine available for preliminary distribution before the end of this year. That is very good news. It's also the case that people that have gotten the virus have natural immunity to it, which will limit the spread if we have a reoccurrence. So people are very uncertain right now. As you mentioned, many people have lost their jobs. Many Main Street businesses are closed. We've seen a collapse in our commodity markets, particularly beef, but others as well. And I'm optimistic about the resiliency of Americans. I know certainly Montanans we're getting our arms around this, and we're getting to the other side. The focus in Congress has really been in making sure we have the relief in place that, given the government has told businesses to shut down, we have an obligation to help them open back up so we can get back some form of normalcy.
Congressman, that's great news about the vaccine. Looking forward to hearing more information about that. There's so many things the government can do to help us out currently, but if you could say there's one thing the government must do right now to get the U.S. economy back on track, what would you say that is?
Well, I think we're all hankering to get back to normal. And honestly, as we get our arms around the public health crisis, the most important thing is to get individuals, families, and businesses back on their feet. And that was the focus of the CARES Act, which we passed a number of weeks ago. Really unprecedented steps for relief for individuals and for small businesses, as well as our healthcare professionals, to make sure they get back on their feet. This was now with the replenishment of the Payroll Protection Act. This is now $2.5 trillion, and I'd put myself at the head of the line in terms of fiscal conservatives. That being said, when government asks businesses to shut down for public health reasons, we have an obligation to help them open back up. But long term, even intermediate term, we're not going to sustain or regain prosperity, jobs through government checks. The only solution here is to open our businesses back up and get our vibrant economy that we had coming into this crisis restarted so people can continue to pursue the American dream. And that's been our focus. So individual payments, the payroll protection program, extended unemployment, more flexibility for the banks to give payment holidays on existing commercial loans and mortgages as a way to push liquidity into the marketplace so that when we push the start button on the economy, we can go back to work.
Do you have a perspective on what the role of states is versus the government at this time? We know some states have opened up faster than others. I'd love to hear your perspective.
Well, I think the steps our president has taken, putting together a 3-phase reopening plan that are recommendations, not mandates. I don't believe one size fits all. For example, I was talking to some folks in a community in Montana. Many of our counties in Montana haven't had a single case of COVID-19, and yet their main street is shut down. Clearly, they can open back up a little more quickly than, for example, Bozeman, Montana, which is my home, where we've had about 150 cases. But even Bozeman is not New York City. We don't have subways that are packed with people, buses packed with people. One size does not fit all. I think the administration's done a good thing in giving that discretion to the governors and to local public health officials to decide, working with local businesses, what is the safe way to open back up, pursuing public health, but also realizing we have to get individuals and businesses back on their feet.
And that is a great line. One size does not fit all. That's going to be a major theme today, especially as we transition to our work in education. We say that quite often at ACE. Greg, last question for you in this section is, you are traveling around the state of Montana and the country often. Perhaps not right now as much as you have, but I know that you're on quite a few town halls and phone calls to this. You interface with a lot of people. Can you share one great story of kindness that you've witnessed that will lift us up today?
Oh, sure, I'd be happy to. And I do. I've been doing 6 to 8 calls like this almost every day with local chambers and various industry associations, trying to communicate hope that I believe this is unprecedented. It's a rough patch, but I am confident the resilience of Americans, we're going to get through this and we're going to be stronger on the other side. I was at a grocery store meeting and I was checking out and I was talking to the cashier. All of a sudden, grocery store cashiers have become essential employees at the front line in this battle so that people can get their food. And he made an interesting comment to me. He said, before the crisis, people would come through checking out their groceries. They'd be on their cell phone. They'd be at times rude. It almost seemed like I didn't exist. But then this crisis occurred. And now they see me as an individual who's coming, risking my health to come and make sure people have food. And they are kind to me. They are pleasant. They thank me for my service. And then this cashier made an interesting observation. He said, I haven't changed. I'm still doing my job. And I just think that sort of respect for individuals and the work that they do is a positive silver lining in this crisis. And I hope that we can keep some of that and we're nicer to each other post-crisis.
Greg, thank you for your leadership. I attest to that. I know that being cooped up in our family, we see more people walking their dogs and riding their bikes and actually getting some fresh air. And there seems to be an act of kindness with most people that you don't normally see when we're so busy in the lives that we live. So thank you so much for your perspectives. Once again, to the audience that's on the call, if you have a question and you want any additional information on COVID-19 or anything for Congressman Gianforte, please press *3 and your question will go into the queue. Let me transition to Chris Wright. Chris Wright is one of my favorite people. I love this man. This man just exudes optimism and energy. He's the chairman of Liberty Oilfield Services. He is a leader in the fracking industry and, frankly, just an industry leader in energy as a whole. He's the chairman of the ACE Board of Trustees in Colorado. He is a great mind and a great thinker. And Chris, we are so honored to have you on the call today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Norton, I'm thrilled to be part of the ACE family.
Well, thanks so much, Chris. We appreciate you too. And Chris, I'm going to say a couple stats here and then let you talk a little bit about some of the issues we're facing. Number one is that the International Energy Agency estimates that global oil demand in April is 29 million barrels per day lower than it was 1 year ago. The last time it was this low was 1995. And of course, oil prices have dropped below zero for the first time in history. That's a concept I'm not sure I fully understand. But question number one for you, Chris, is what is going on with Russia and Saudi Arabia, and how much has their fight impacted our country and energy in the world?
Yeah, Norton, first to put some context around the numbers you gave, that oil demand was dropped 29 million barrels a day in April. The math is easy because global oil demand right now is about 100 million barrels a day. So 29 million drop is 29% drop in demand for oil. During the financial crisis, demand for oil dropped 2 to 3 million barrels, 2 to 3% over several months. Now we've dropped 30% over a few weeks. So that's unprecedented. Before that, as it was just starting to drop, we had a spat between Saudi Arabia and Russia. As COVID started in China, by late January and February, there was contraction of demand in oil in China. China is the biggest oil importer in the world and the second largest consumer of oil in the world. So that was already causing stress in oil markets. Saudi Arabia, OPEC, and Russia tried to work out a deal to reduce production, and the Russians wouldn't have it. They wouldn't agree to cut production at all. The new crown prince in Saudi Arabia, who's effectively the ruler, is a little bit of a hothead. I think he was so angry at Russia, he wanted to spite them and said, well, if you're not going to cut, we're going to open the taps. And so Saudi put a whole bunch of more oil onto a market that was already going into oversupply. There's still a massive amount of oil on tankers that's already left Saudi Arabia that's on its way here. And then in the midst of that oversupply, COVID really hit the Western world, starting in Europe and the United States, and the largest oil and gas consuming areas in the world. And this just caused, as Norton said, this huge plummet in demand as supply is already backed up. and this caused just massive dislocations. The world stores about 30 days of demand for oil total. Like if the oil production stopped, we'd be out of oil in 30 days. So it's a finely balanced market, and this in an industry, the largest industry in the world, many trillions of dollars of annual revenue. So when that happened, this abrupt drop in demand, it means storage is filling super rapidly, and it's very hard to find places to put oil. Yeah, and last Monday, oil closed at minus $37. That's tough to make money, and you can't make it up on volume if you're getting paid minus $37 a barrel for your product.
Chris, I know that you're an optimist, and certainly there's a lot to be pessimistic about, or at least to focus on the negativity. But as an optimist, when you look at the energy sector, how do we make the improvements we need to get oil and energy back on track again?
So Norton, the fabulous thing is the oil and gas market is generally a relatively free market. It's an indication of what we're trying to get in education. So it responds to market signals. Oil production's declining rapidly today, not just in OPEC and Russia who agreed, and therefore the governments decided to cut production. All of Liberty's customers in U.S. oil and gas production, same in Canada and Brazil, they're reducing their production because the price signal is sending that message, and they've got nowhere to put the oil. So we're going to go through a very rough patch. But look, this is America. These are businesses. These are entrepreneurs. They will bounce back, and we'll come out the other side. But certainly the most stressful downturn or dislocation I've ever seen in my career. I will say one thing to look back on where we came from. Last year was just awesome for American energy production. Last year is the first year since 1957 that the U.S. produced more energy than we consumed. We went from the largest importer of natural gas to the third largest exporter. We're the third largest exporter of oil in the world. So energy has been a great tailwind for the country, definitely in a rough patch now. Last thing I'll say about my industry, the oil and gas industry. Last year, oil and gas supplied just under 70% of total energy consumed in the United States. That's the highest market share ever in the history of the oil and gas industry. So we're in tough situations right now, but we're full of innovative, resilient people, and it'll come back. Of course it'll come back. The key thing to drive that, Norton, is economic growth. As the shutdowns end and people start driving to work again, people go visit grandma and start to do things, as the economy comes back, demand for oil and gas will come back.
Well said, Chris. Thanks so much for sharing that. Let me do a little transition to education. And Chris, I know you've been studying the impact that COVID-19 has had on low-income families in particular. And obviously at ACE Scholarships, that is the market that we are focused on, is giving low-income families a choice to go to great schools so they're not being left behind. Can you share what our families must do or what we can do to support low-income families the very most right now?
Yeah, it's key. Look, all of us here, everyone that's joined this call is motivated to help spread the American dream, that opportunity to pursue your dream to as widely as possible. There's people that are less fortunate. They can't move to the good school districts or afford to pay for private school themselves. Unfortunately, it's those families that are being hurt the most by this downturn. Technology workers, my brother's business, no different at all. You know, Amazon's hiring rapidly. If you're in the financial industry, you're booming, you're doing well. But low-income people tend to work hourly jobs. They tend to work in service jobs where they're around people. They're working at restaurants or retail. They're working in the travel industry at hotels or whatever. Their jobs have been hit the hardest. Everyone's been hit, but the people least able to absorb the blow have been hit the hardest. We need those folks, and those are the ACE families. Those are the ACE parents that are raising our kids. We need to get them back to work as soon as possible. They're under extra stress at home. It's harder for them to do remote learning. You know, our kids, they log onto the internet, they get a quiet room, and they can do their work. But if you're home with parents that don't have the education level that their kids are going to achieve, they don't have internet access at home, they got a lot of kids in a small place, those home learning environments, they're under extreme stress, emotional stress as well as financial stress. There's never been a time where support for ACE to keep these kids on scholarships and outreach to those families is more needed than today. But this is the community that does that stuff.
Chris, I couldn't agree more. And you're right. That's what makes America so great is that when times are tough, we dig in and we support those who need it the very most. I'm proud to say to everyone that's on this call today that of our 800 private schools, we are receiving information back from them that despite the fact they may not be online schools, and this is not their expertise, they've adjusted. They've actually pivoted to the crisis right now, and they're finding ways to still get education into the homes of our families right now. And as most of you can imagine, they don't have the technology that we do. They don't have the resources, but the schools are absolutely heroic. They are doing all they can to help these families. And that's why you'll hear us often say at ACE that we have the easy job. We are just the intermediary between a family and their student going to a great school. The schools are really our heroes. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone's aware of the fact that it may not be ideal, but we're still finding ways to educate our families. So let's transition now into education. And again, we have two great authorities here to chat about this. I want to remind those on the call, if you want to hit *3 for a question, please do so. And in just a few minutes, we'll address your questions. There's a saying that this may be the last great civil rights issue, the education of low-income families. And for many of us who are plugged in, we can agree more. There is an enormous disparity between wealthy and middle-income families and low-income families. Middle-income families live in neighborhoods where good public schools may exist. Wealthy families send their kids where they want. Low-income families are trapped. Congressman Gianforte, in 2012, you reached out to me out of the blue the last week in December, and you said that you and your wife Susan had an interest in launching an ACE program in the state of Montana. And I'd like you to tell us more about that. But before you do that, I just want to tell everyone on this call a couple really cool things. We have given over 6,000 scholarships in Montana, thanks to Greg and Susan and their leadership. And in addition to Montana, we also launched an effort in Wyoming a couple years ago that they also personally contributed to. So Greg, thanks again. But tell us why it is that you wanted to bring ACE to Montana.
Well, America is the land of opportunity. However, it's not an equal playing field, particularly for lower income families. And we saw it in Montana. The dropout rate amongst lower income students in high schools was much, much higher. Over 70% of the dropouts in Montana were for lower income families. And for people of means, they have parental choice. They can choose to live in a district where the school they want, that's a good match for their children, exists. Lower income families don't have that same mobility, and they certainly don't have the resources to pick a school that might be a better fit for the learning style of their child. And in our charitable giving, my wife and I, we look for organizations that have track records of success. And seeing what ACE had done in Colorado was very encouraging to us. That's why I reached out to you, Norton, back in 2012, and why we're so excited to bring the program here. As you mentioned now, we've done over 6,000 scholarships in Montana, and we've changed outcomes. You've heard the stories. Young people who had lost hope because they were trapped in an environment that wasn't a good fit for them. And we know that every child is created for some great purpose, and we need to help them reach their full potential. That's what ACE is all about. That's what motivated us, and it's been such a satisfying journey to see the impact here in Montana and to see the impact that ACE is having across the country now.
Thank you. And what I love about these calls is that they really are interactive. And Eddie Rispondi from Louisiana shot me a text message during this call, and it's a great reminder. He wanted me to let everyone know that the majority of our kids are coming from single parent households. So these are heroic families. These are families that make less than $40,000 per year, and they're contributing a third of their income to education, which is absolutely remarkable. And there's a great saying, if they can come to the table with such little resources, we certainly can do our help them out, which we've done. Chris, I know one of your heroes in life is the great Milton Friedman. And you and your wife Liz actually had a unique opportunity personally when you lived in the Bay Area, spending time with him. And I remember seeing Milton and his wife Rose when they came to Colorado close to 20 years ago when I first began my career at ACE. And they were remarkable then, and to this day, their legacy endures as leaders. Would you tell us a little bit more about Milton Friedman and his philosophy on free markets and education?
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned I was optimistic. I mean, probably the most optimistic person I ever met was Milton and his wife, Rose. Both charming, happy, upbeat at all times. Doesn't matter what the opposition were. And they had reason to be optimistic. But Rose was born in the Soviet Union. She saw grinding poverty. Both of them grew up relatively poor. But they saw this just incredible success that was the United States and sought to understand, why is that? Why is it? The world had been run top down throughout all of human history and was still run top down in the Soviet Union. And just in the few generations before them, things had really started to get better. Human life expectancies doubled in less than the last 200 years. We had 90% of people in grinding poverty. Today, that's less than 10% and dropping. And what they recognized was, when people are free to pursue their own ends and their own needs. And how do you make money? You make money by serving someone, bringing someone to something better than they're getting from somewhere else. So that this freedom, this free to choose, made things better. People want different things in life, and it frees people to pursue what's important to them. And the cost of goods and the quality of goods just kept getting better. People live longer, healthier, longer lives. So I think they saw so much great going on around them, but their frustration and what they spent their money and really the end of their lives focused on was one issue, and that was education, because they saw that as this incredibly important, maybe the most important industry we have, together with healthcare. They saw this incredibly important industry that wasn't exposed to competition, that didn't involve choice for everyone. And so they saw it wasn't improving at the same rate of every other industries, and it was the most unequal of all our industries. Where Greg and I's kids have gotten great educations, as yours are, Norton, but so many families don't have that opportunity. And it's wrong, it's unequal, and it's un-American. But the Friedmans were awesome, and they got what made the world better.
Remarkable. And curious about Chris, I'd like you to share is school choice is sometimes perceived as toxic, and that it's anti-public schools. That's simply not the case. Can you address that, please?
Yeah, of course it's not at all. Look, both Liz and I went through public schools all the way from kindergarten through high school. There's plenty of good public schools. The reason that all of our families, or a lot of families, move to where the public schools are the best or where they're a good fit for them. But most people don't have that freedom, right? If you're a low-income person, unfortunately, you get the double whammy. You live generally in tougher, more violent neighborhoods, and those schools are the worst. And when you find out, you don't have a choice, well, my kid's kind of this way or my kid's that way. It's, what's your address? That's your school. So if you come from a home where maybe there's not a lot of education, as Eddie pointed out so well, so many single families, you don't have as much optimism, as much belief in the future at home, and then you go to a violent, bureaucratic controlled school that's sort of a one-size-fits-all, and they tend to be larger. This is unfair. Now, it's viewed as choice must hurt all these schools or whatever, but that's not true at all. And that, I would say, was disproven 25 years ago when Milwaukee and Wisconsin introduced school choice in the city. Their schools were so bad, everyone was fleeing, the population was plummeting, people were leaving to the suburbs. There was an abrupt action to introduce school choice into the Milwaukee school system. Now, of course, private schools grew and people exercised choice. The part you don't hear about that story a lot is enrollment in the public schools grew. The public schools grew from bottom quartile in the country to average or better than average. They got better. They attracted students. Why did they do that? Because they had competition. Any business subject to competition gets better. School choice is not negative for public schools. The lack of it is holding them back, slowing their innovation, slowing their rate of improvement.
Well said. Let's go to some questions from our audience here. I'd like to ask Congressman Gianforte, and this comes from, I'm going to give a shout out to Miles Mendoza, who is a great friend and a great leader in this movement. And Miles has a good question. He says, as we focus on recovery for education system, both private and public schools, do you see this as an opportunity for more bipartisanship around school choice?
I think we should. This is honestly the most important issue is how do we help our kids have a brighter future? There should be bipartisan support. I've found, you'd think that nothing happens on a bipartisan basis in Washington. My own experience, having been there coming on 3 years, is that I have not experienced any personal animosity. I have over a dozen bills moving through the House right now that are completely bipartisan, but this is mostly a state's issue. I think it was appropriate that the best decisions in education get made at the local level by local school boards. They know what's right for their families and their communities. And I think that we ought to be able to back up to the core principles, which is let's help every child reach their full potential. That's where our focus ought to be. And as Chris so articulately said, when parents have choices, they can pick the one that's best for their child, and everyone wins. And typically, when a child's in a school and it's not a good fit for whatever reason, that student ends up taking a lot of resources away from the other students that are there, and it's a hindrance for achievement for all the students. So again, getting a student in an environment where they can succeed to help them reach their full potential has got to be the priority in all of this.
Yeah, well said. The next question I have is from Shelley in Houston. And Chris, I'm going to have you address this question. And her question is, what's the number one thing a leader should consider when it comes to communication during a crisis?
Look, at a crisis, people are fearful. They have anxiety. They're worried about their health. They're worried about their future. So I think a key thing for a leader is to communicate an optimism. And there's well-founded optimism. This is America. We've had far greater challenges than this before. We're going to get through this, and we're going to be stronger. So I think a leader needs to inspire optimism, but a thoughtful optimism about why people should be optimistic and why they can take actions that can not only help their own future outcomes, but they can help those around them. Nothing makes people happier than helping other people. Helping other people. Look, one of the greatest joys my wife and I have in our life is our involvement with this ACE community. Together, this community and this community's generosity has changed the trajectory of tens of thousands of lives and then their families. Nothing is more uplifting, inspiring, and optimistic than that. So as a leader, help people get engaged to help others. They'll feel better about themselves, their joy will grow, and they'll become optimistic.
Well said, Chris. Thank you so much. So the next question, and this is a really fun one. Greg, you're going to love this one here. This comes from Misty Cool. I hope I pronounced that name correctly there. I'm assuming Misty is in Montana. But her question is, I serve on ACE's Native American Youth Initiative. Can Congressman Gianforte speak to how the initiative was realized? I'm excited about that question because a little backdrop on that. I remember when you and Susan launched the program, you said that we are passionate not just about serving low-income families, but also helping out Native American families in Montana. And you've absolutely done that. So can you speak to this, please?
Yeah, and this was a real focus from day one of ACE in Montana. We have about 7% of our population is Native American. Our reservations have not been areas of opportunity. Unemployment's very high. We have drug issues in all of our communities, but they are more pronounced on the reservation. And so I appreciate your question, Misty. I know your heart is in our Native American communities, and you have dedicated your life to making sure we make progress there. We do have a legacy of independent schools in our Native American communities. And it was a little bit of a challenge because some of these schools didn't fit the ACE model exactly. So Misty served on that Native American outreach committee that we put together. And then we partnered. We went to these Native American schools that were on the reservations in Montana and just said, listen, you are, there's the children you have, the students you have in your schools are just as important as every other child. We want to help them reach their full potential. What would be the way that we are most useful? And I think the story I liked the most was there was a Catholic school up in Hayes, Montana, on the Fort Belknap reservation, and it had been there for a long, long time. And there were a number of sisters that taught in that school, and their average age, I think, was north of 80 years old each. And they had an old bus that was broken down, and it gets cold in Hayes, and it might have been 40 below, and yet these nuns had to drive that bus to pick up the students. And unfortunately, that bus broke down. So instead of scholarships, because there was no tuition in the school, it was free to those that chose to go there. We ended up working with that school to get them a new bus so that these 80-year-old nuns wouldn't get stuck in a snowbank someplace. Again, we had to adapt the ACE model, but we were able to be relevant based on the input we got from our Native American communities.
Well, and also, too, you'll love this. The Native American population has received close to $1 million the last 6 years in scholarships through our program. And last year, randomly, I was visiting the chair of our National Advisory Board, Foster Freeze, and his beautiful wife, Lynn. And we were actually at a show in downtown Jackson, and I was looking at this beautiful photographic art, and I was talking to whose art it was, and it turns out that she was an ACE scholarship recipient. She's a Native American, and she came from St. Lebray. So that's thanks to ACE Montana, and she was to this day very grateful. Chris, I have a question for you about yes. This comes from Brian Crow. Thanks, Brian, for your question. We appreciate it. His question is, does oil have a shelf life, or can it be stored for extended periods against future demand?
Brian, so no, oil doesn't really have a shelf life. It's just large in volume. So the largest or long-term storages of oil are underground, like in salt caverns or whatever. But no, oil does not have a shelf life. We would not have had oil at negative $37 a barrel if we had an ability to store that oil. So there's just a finite amount of storage, but it's in fact, oil is in general tens of millions of years old, and it's got a lot of years left. Thanks, Brian, for the question.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. We sure appreciate it. This question comes from Jason in Kansas City. And Chris, this question's for you. How do you inspire resilience and positivity within your team and an organization during a time of crisis?
Again, number one, we all have reasons to be optimistic. I sit here and my heart warms as I hear Greg Gianforte talk about that school bus was one of the first things he did early on in ACE in Montana. And Greg and Susan, when they see a challenge, it doesn't have to be the same challenge. They just figure out how to make people's lives better. So to be around people like Greg and Susan and Norton and the ACE community, that makes me happy. That inspires me. So it's stories. Look, you're in an organization and it's having tough times. Tell stories about when things were good or about when things were bad and you did something, you hung together and they got better. We tell a lot of stories. Look, there was a terrible the worst downturn I'd ever seen in my life in the oil industry was 4 years ago. Just brutal, hundreds of thousands of lost jobs. It was a terrible time. We were able to hold on to everyone at our company. We fought through it together, and we look back on that. As we're going through this tough time, we look back at that one and say, hey, we hung together then, and we got out. So I also think human relationships become deeper and stronger when times are tough. When times are good, yeah, everybody's happy and you kind of do whatever, but relationships tend to be a little bit shallower when things are really tough. That's where character comes out. And that's where deep, forever lasting relationships are formed. So actually a lot of greatness, a lot of great things for the rest of your life arrive during tough times.
Absolutely. Again, that's the resilience of our country. So, Greg, I'm going to ask you another question here from someone on this call, and their question is related to technology. And obviously, you and Susan started a wonderful company out of your basement. And I mentioned earlier that you sold to Oracle. Talk about how education right now is going to play a major role in, well, I should say, technology is going to play a major role in education moving forward.
Yeah, there's no question. In fact, I think this is going to be one of the residual effects of this crisis. I would even call it a silver lining. We've had to embrace technology faster than we would have normally done it. We're figuring out how to do remote instruction. We're figuring out how to use digital content. And I know many of the people on the call here are students of education innovation. I'm a big fan of Sal Khan and what he did with the Khan Academy as a way of pioneering really self-based learning, a shift to more of mastery focus rather than proficiency. I think it's a much better way to teach mathematics. And my daughter, Rachel, just recently graduated from college with an engineering degree. I'm really proud that she's decided to go and teach high school calculus because it's important that we have the world continues to get more complicated, and it's usually changes like this, crises like this, that encourage us to embrace change more quickly. And I think this bringing technology into the classroom is really important. And you know, Norton, I've been a big proponent of doing computer programming at younger ages. We started a program here in Montana called Code Montana, which provided a software development curriculum to every high school student in the state. It's now available for college credit. This was done outside the establishment because we didn't have that much help from the education establishment. But computers are here to stay. And the classroom has been an area that has been slow to embrace innovation. Again, it's crises like this that will cause us to embrace changes more quickly. And I think students will benefit.
Well said. A great question here from someone that we know also is Dow. And Chris, you know Richard. You spent a lot of time with him. He's a great graduate from our program in Colorado. So I'm going to let you take a crack at his question. Richard, thanks so much for this question. You said, what can we do as a community to help low-income families better prepare themselves financially, specifically regarding financial education?
Wow, Greg, boy, Richard's so smart. Thought for sure he was going to ask me a question over my head, and that one's close. But and this has been a focus of Richard himself. You know, Richard obviously grew up in a lower income community. He's a very smart guy and he's done very well himself. But with economic dislocations, he's seen struggles as well, and that is not a common skill set, I would say, across the country as a whole, and particularly in low income families. You know, people tend to live paycheck to paycheck. You know, they have money, they may not be frivolous, but they spend what they have to live on. So the idea of saving and putting away from the future is just less common there. I would say it's not completely common there. And in fact, Richard, I'm going to answer that with another ACE family that you know as well, and I won't say their names, but a fabulous family that we've become very close to. The mom comes from South Sudan, one of the poorest countries in the world, from the middle of a civil war, and fleeing, never able to step foot in a classroom in her life. She's got one college grad already, one that's about to graduate from Notre Dame, and three more that are all ACE kids that are moving on and doing well. But no exposure to financial system and saving, but she got saving. She saved all of her money in cash and never built credit, you know, had trouble buying something, didn't use our banking system, so was paying bills with money orders or delivering cash to pay things. And as part of become close as families, my wife has really embraced and become a part of this family. So has been introducing them to the financial system and how to make transactions easier and how to save money that's not in a box. But in that case, that mindset of saving money, that fundamental, Don't spend everything you have today. Mindset was already there, but how to implement that to make life easier was not. Our basic message, and I should have got to this quicker, is just it doesn't matter how much money you make. If you save 20% of the money you make, you will be financially well off, no matter what you make. Both of the housekeepers, one that worked for us in San Francisco and one here in Denver, both own houses. One of them, we helped only technically, not financially, buy a house in San Francisco, solely because both of these gals saved more than 20% of the money they made. And if you just keep doing that, you're ready for your rough times or whatever. Now, that's a lesson that doesn't work in the short term. When crisis hits right now, you've got to take different actions. But I think really, Richard, the advice is as simple as save 20% at least of what you make for the future, and you'll have a great retirement, and you'll be resilient to whenever tough times hit, as they've hit now.
Thanks, Chris. And Richard also, too. Richard is one of our all-stars in this program, and I remember when he spoke at the ACE Luncheon probably 10 years ago now, and what a great inspiration he's been. He's doing amazing things. Two more questions as we come to a conclusion here. And Chris, I assume you're going to answer this one here. This comes from Brandon Johnson in Denver. Brandon, thanks so much for the question. Your question is approximately how much oil is currently being stored globally, and how will that affect returning to a level where producers can make a profit after supply and demand reach equilibrium?
Okay, wow. So technical questions from Brandon. So globally right now, there's 3.2 billion barrels of oil that's stored. And again, we consume 100 million barrels a day in normal times. So that's 32 days worth of oil. But if I looked back 6 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, there was 2.9 billion barrels. So that extra 300 million barrels of oil that's gone into storage has led to a plummeting of prices. And oil prices are basically a match of supply and demand and the size of storage. So, production's growing so low right now that storage will eventually fill. And then, because production will have had to have matched demand, and then as the world comes back to life, demand is going to go up. It's going to cross supply, and we'll start to pull oil out of storage, nearly full storage. Doesn't mean oil prices will be high then. Storage will be drawing, but we'll still have such, relatively speaking, high levels of storage. That'll keep oil prices down. I would say for American production, you probably need $40 a barrel oil for a good amount of our resources to be profitable. Some is profitable at 30, virtually nothing at $20 a barrel. And at $50 to $60 a barrel, our industry will become healthy. In fact, it'll be much healthier than it was the last time oil was $50 or $60, because every time there's a shock to a system, not just in our industry, people innovate and they figure out how to do stuff cheaper and easier and faster, and they lower the price at which they can be profitable. So industry is going to have a very tough run, but it will come back, I think, stronger and better than ever. Thank you, Brandon.
Thanks, Brandon. Thanks, Chris. Okay, last question for Greg. And I'm going to have a dual question here from Darla Romfo in New York, who's spending her time in Florida these days. Darla's with the Children's Scholarship Fund. They've been a longtime supporter of ACE. And without Children's Scholarship Fund and the late Walton, the great late John Walton, ACE potentially wouldn't exist today. So Darla, thank you for all you do and the millions of dollars each year that your foundation is giving. I've got a question from her and also Michael O'Hagan, who is actually a principal and president, I should say, at one of our Rupe Jesuit, one of the great all-star schools. Darla's question is along the lines of the fact that our families are living on razor-thin margins already, and they're already at risk of greater calamity. Any thoughts on how we can keep this from happening through public or private support? Obviously, Greg, we've talked about some things already we can do to improve. And so in addition to that, Michael O'Hagan asked, as we prepare for return to in-person instruction this fall, what resources small independent schools be gathering? Is it access to a supply in masks, personal dedication to monitoring student health, modules, etc.? So, Greg, to the extent you can, if you can join those and answer it, thank you.
Yeah, good. Well, thanks for the question, Darla. And Norton, I'm not sure you know the connection, but when I was researching organizations to partner with to give opportunity to lower income families, it was Darla that said, you ought to call Norton Rainey. So that's the connection. So we have that history together. I think that a lot of what we've done in the CARES Act, I'm proud of the fact that over 50% of the funding in the CARES Act is targeted to individuals and small businesses. So a family, a single mom with two kids is getting $1,200 plus $500 per dependent child. Those checks are in their bank account. Again, this is not the long-term solution. It's a bridge to get through this tough spot to help them get back on their feet. A family of four got a check for $3,400. Now, that's not going to replace a job. The most important thing we need to do is get individuals back on their feet, get small businesses open back up, and get our economy going again. Now, in terms of precautions for schools, we're learning every day more and more about this coronavirus. We're learning, for example, that honestly, school age kids, if they're otherwise of good health, don't have that much risk for severe complications from the virus. It primarily affects people with respiratory issues and people of older age. It's also the case that once you've had it, the health professionals tell us you have a heightened level of immunity. In fact, you probably can't re-get the virus again during a certain period of time, maybe a longer period. And medical trials are in place right now to really understand that. So our learning has been increasing every single day. I would encourage folks, particularly superintendents of schools, to watch the CDC website for specific guidelines. I know that there will be guidelines published specifically for schools prior to the opening in September. We have to take necessary precautions. Will PPE equipment be required? I don't know. It depends on those guidelines. We're going to learn a lot more about this virus over the course of this summer, and I would encourage you to continue to look both to industry associations and ultimately the CDC, who will be publishing guidelines here.
I met Darla
Thank you.
at the Ace Montana event at Greg's house. Yeah, and just a gal who spent her life trying to spread opportunity through scholarships for low-income kids. And I employ at Liberty several Arupe Jesuit high school grads. Half of them were ACE scholars. And that's just a tremendous school. And wow, my hat is off to those two individuals that have asked that question. I am a lucky guy to be around people like this.
What a great call. I'm inspired. I'm so grateful that you would take time out of your very busy schedules to join us and help us understand these very important issues in our country right now. And for our guest who joined in, thank you for taking time. And listen, what we want to say to you today is that we know that you're smart people who invest in causes that make a difference. And the work of ACE Scholarships is extraordinary. And I hope you've learned a little bit more today about the fact that you can take a family that's in dire and you can put them into a very healthy environment and you can help them realize wonderful dreams in their lives like we've been able to do. And that's really what we do at ACE. It's a very basic concept. Obviously, these times have hurt us as an organization. We're thinking about steps moving forward. We have cut our budget tremendously, and we're making sure that we can also prepare for the future so we can serve as many kids as we possibly can. So if you want to learn more, please go to our website at www.scholarships.org. Thank you again, Congressman Gianforte. Chris, for your time. We are so grateful, and blessings to everyone. Thanks again.